Hey, today I wanted to talk about Linux, the open source operating system, as an alternative to Microsoft Windows or Apple's Macintosh. I want to talk about my experience. Sorry, there's a seagull. I want to talk about my experience with Linux and why I use it versus other operating systems, and why you should too. So I first got into Linux about 6 years ago, hardcore, and I use it 80% of the time. And the only time I use an alternative would be I'd use Windows to do some video editing, and I'll explain why in a minute. So Linux started in the 90s as an open source project by Linus Torvald, and it's basically a community-led open source free for everyone to use alternative to other operating systems, which are proprietary. Windows and Macintosh have all of their systems closed off. There's no way for the user to actually change things or to customize or to see what's actually running on their computer. So that's why Linux makes a great alternative. I'd say one of the biggest motivations though to use Linux as a desktop, if you are maybe a student or you're young or you just don't have much money, and you're getting a laptop and you don't have an operating system yet and you're thinking to install Windows. The problem with Windows is there's a cost behind it. You actually have to pay, I think, a couple of $100 for it, as far as I'm aware, and it comes with a lot of limitations. So Windows nowadays, they force a lot of updates on you quite regularly. This can take up bandwidth of your internet. It can be disturbing when you're trying to use programs. And they also send telemetry, basically information about your system, to their servers. They argue that this is obviously for protection or like to improve the system, but they are also gathering personal information. Like recently there was some sort of scandal where they had uploaded private documents or people's folders to their servers, as far as I'm aware. I don't want to get the details wrong on that, but basically you're not guaranteed any sort of privacy on Windows, and you're also not guaranteed any sort of control over your system either. That's where Linux comes in. You're paying literally nothing. It's developed in the open. You can see the code for yourself, and you can talk to the community, and you can pick different distributions, different flavors of Linux. It's not just one available Linux. There's Ubuntu, Mint, Fedora, Arch Linux, amongst many others. And so you can set it up as complicated or as simply as you like. I think what gives people a lot of hesitation is they're not familiar with Linux when they first start, and they see it as quite complicated. But that was true 10 years ago when I first saw Linux. It seemed quite awkward to set up, and there was a lot of issues with integration into the hardware of the computer. But nowadays that's actually quite a minimal problem, but it's still a problem, as I'll explain in a minute. Nowadays you can just run through an installation guide, maybe go for Ubuntu or one of the other more mainstream distributions, and you'll be set up in minutes, honestly. Linux will have all of the tools that you need. You can do video editing, like for simple videos like I'm doing now. You can use a tool called Kdenlive, which is a fantastic editing tool, by the way. You can even use it on Windows. It's a shout out to that tool. And the command line is basically superior to all other command lines. You can basically do anything on it, whatever you want. And yeah, it basically has all of the tools you would want on Windows or Apple's Macintosh. The other thing that argument or reason personally that I stuck with Windows for so long was gaming. I like to play a few games, and for a long time that was difficult on Linux, I will admit. But recently with graphics libraries becoming cross-platform, and with a big push from Steam with the release of Steam Deck, which is actually written on Arch Linux, there's been a big push for cross-platform and for the ability to play games on Linux, and now that has become quite possible for many games. And so even that argument now recently, only in the past 2 years, has faded, making it a viable option The other great thing about Linux is the control is in your hands. You can change anything in any way that you want. If you're not happy with the way it's set up, you can change it. You don't have to accept forced updates. You don't have to accept anything, and this is quite a powerful thing, because it's always nice to feel like you have the control in your hands and that you can do things as you want them to be. And you can also set up your desktop as you want. A lot of people have a very custom desktop. It means anything you do, you can do quite quickly. The other thing is privacy. There's no telemetry going anywhere unless you choose there to be, unlike Windows, as we've just mentioned. And if you're going to be a software developer, I highly recommend Linux, because all of your hosting for your website or your development on a Raspberry Pi or whatever it is, a lot of this hardware servers and things will be running a Linux operating system in some form or another. And it can be useful to develop on this, because you're kind of direct to the source. And even if you're not developing for Linux, you're thinking, well, I want to distribute to Windows as well. You can often compile and develop cross-platform on Linux, so that's often not too big of a problem. The only exception being Mac OS, which often tries to force you to compile everything on their hardware. Let me talk about some of the downsides of Linux. So we talked about a lot of upsides. Some of the downsides are music software, I would say, is not as developed on Linux, although it does exist. If you need reliability, if you're playing gigs or you're getting serious into music, it's another reason I still have Windows, is because tools like Ableton, which is a very famous music tool, it's a DAW, so basically where you do all of your recording and developing of music. This only works on, unfortunately, Windows or Macintosh. I have a sneaky suspicion that they will develop on Linux soon, because they have a new thing called the Ableton Push Tree, which is like your Ableton software on a device, a hardware. And the only way I see that working is if they run that on Linux, because Linux is small and lightweight compared to a Windows operating system. So I imagine they're running that on some sort of Linux, but they have yet to release any sort of user-friendly version of this, so I don't know what's going on there. Another downside is you could argue you can use Linux on Windows anyways. They do have some sort of emulated Linux now available on Windows, and tools that were once exclusive to Linux, such as Docker, are becoming available on Windows. However, I will say a lot of tools are developed with the idea of being available and native on Linux, because a lot of developers that are developing free and open source tools for software developers or for anyone are often doing it on Linux. So in some ways it's still better, but you could argue that Windows is enough. Finally, the last point I want to make is just how much fun it is to use Linux. My personal experience with it has been that I've learned a lot as I became a software developer over the years. Moving over to Linux alone just taught me so much about my computer. Like I had Windows on my machine, and I thought, oh, I want to develop this particular thing on Linux. Let me give it a go. And I still wanted to keep my Windows, so I partitioned my hard drive, which is a thing a lot of people who use Linux who don't want to go all in at first will do. And that taught me a lot about my hard drive, about how everything is set up, and it taught me a lot about the BIOS, because I had to change settings in the BIOS. And before this, the BIOS was some sort of NASA command line screen that I didn't understand, and now it makes more sense to me. It's actually quite simple when you understand it. And as well, the bootloader, like how your computer is booting up. I had to learn a bit about this and install a thing called Grub that would handle all of this for me. And yeah, just generally learning about a lot of tooling, a lot of the interaction between the hardware and the operating system, something that I probably wouldn't have dived into so deep without going over to Linux. Having said that, it doesn't have to be complicated. A lot of people can just wipe their Windows, USB load on Linux, and just be done with it. But it's more that you have the option to go in depth, and you have the option to learn a lot about your system. Whereas I feel with Windows, you're often you're pushed away from that. You're told, just install this SDK, just install these packages and don't worry about it. But in Linux, you do all your own package management. You do all your own setup if you want to. That's the thing, it's a choice. And that choice can be a lot of fun. It can be a lot of fun customizing everything to your own comfort. Like it's like moving the furniture in your house. You could buy the IKEA set and just have it plunked down, ready to go for you. Or you could, pick different pieces of furniture to decorate. And that's the way I kind of see Linux. So if you're curious, give it a go, definitely. Try to go for maybe partition your hard drive and boot it up, try it out. Or dig out an old laptop, put on Linux. You can give it new life. Often laptops that will struggle with Windows 11, maybe because of the demands, will run totally smooth on Linux, because you can get a really lightweight versions of Linux that really don't take much on the system. If you're really on a tight budget, then definitely go with Linux. Don't waste your money on Windows unless you have to. With Linux, you can set everything up for free, and your crappy little laptop will run perfectly on Linux. And don't worry about learning it. The learning is actually quite fun, and you don't have to dive so deep into it. You can get the package management done by a tool. You could just use the desktop as you would with Windows and just not worry about all of the intricate details of it. If you're coming at it from just a user perspective and not looking at any sort of development, you can just get the browser set up your browser, run all your tools. There's open source versions of Word, such as LibreOffice. Put those on and you're ready to go. You have everything you need. These are my thoughts on Linux. There's a lot of different ways of coming at it. It's a very flexible thing. It's a very a lot of passionate people out there using Linux. And so if you have any thoughts, any questions, let me know. I'd like to hear other people's experiences. Thanks.